Hi, welcome to my kitchen. My name is Sue, and today we're going to learn the fine art of making a Greek specialty, baklava. It's Christmas time, and at Christmas time, no self-respecting Greek would not make baklava. It's a must for family, to give away to friends, neighbors, co-workers. It's a wonderful treat. It's a wonderful gift. And as I said, it is the queen of Greek desserts. Just look at it. Layers and layers of the thin filo pastry, chopped nuts, and the whole thing soaked through and through with a wonderful, rich honey syrup. It's delicious. It looks hard to make. It looks complicated, but the reality is it's quite simple. So today we're going to learn together and work together on making this simple but exquisite Greek specialty. Baklava is actually made up of 6 simple ingredients. First, the filo dough. This is the thin pastry dough. Now you're so lucky. We can get this in the grocery stores in the frozen food section. It used to be made by hand. Some wonderful, dear, older Greek ladies still do it, but for people like me, it's great in the frozen food section. Another ingredient, nuts. Traditionally, Greeks use walnuts, but Greeks from different regions can use, sometimes they'll use almonds or a combination. My family has always used walnuts. Honey. What can I say? You have to have honey. It's not a Greek dessert without honey. Butter. It has to be butter, and it has to be unsalted. If it's salted butter, it'll ruin the flavor. But unsalted butter is what you need. A little bit of sugar, and then spices, cinnamon, and cloves. Put these few ingredients together, and this is what you get. You get the final product, baklava. I want to say a few words about the ingredients. Don't skimp on any of them. You have to have butter. You can't do this with margarine. And as I said before, it needs to be unsalted. You need to be prepared to buy yourself a big jug of honey. Yes, it's a little expensive, but the end result is worthwhile. The nuts can be expensive. I would recommend going to a store where you can get them in bulk, as I did. They're a little cheaper that way. But baklava is simple. It's not cheap. But if you use the good ingredients, you are going to have a wonderful taste treat that you will truly be proud of. And it will be different from the baklava you taste in restaurants and the baklava you can pick up at bakeries. It will be great. I'm making a recipe to fit my baklava pan. This is a 16 by 11 pan. We will also give you a recipe for a more traditional 13 by 9 inch pan. But the recipe I'm working with right now is for this 16 by 11 pan. The first thing you have to remember when making baklava, you need to get all your ingredients prepared beforehand. You can't open the filo until the very last minute, until you're ready to assemble the whole dessert. And so the first thing we'll start with is the nuts. Now this is 2 pounds of walnuts, and the goal is to grind this up and get it ready to be the baklava filling. I know that you can purchase ground walnuts. However, I believe they're a little more expensive, and it doesn't take that much time if you have a food processor. So this is what I'm going to start doing, is grinding up the walnuts to get them ready for the filling. As you put the walnuts into the processor, just check to make sure that no little bits and pieces from the shell are in the walnuts. I want you to see the texture, the size of the pieces. It should be just like this, kind of like breadcrumbs. And as you grind each portion, just place it into a bowl, because we're going to need to mix the walnuts with sugar and spices. As you can see, the nuts are now all nicely ground, and they need to be flavored for the filling. You can also see that is an awful lot of walnuts. That's why baklava is not an inexpensive dessert. It's for a special occasion, and Christmas is a special occasion in Greek households. So to this 2 pounds of ground walnuts, you will add a half a cup of sugar. Now that's not an awful lot of sugar considering the proportion of nuts, but remember, this whole concoction is going to be bathed in a honey syrup, so there's absolutely no need to make it any sweeter on the filling. Half a cup of sugar, and then the spices, cinnamon and cloves. 2 teaspoons of ground cinnamon, and 1/4 teaspoon of ground cloves. This is my family recipe. It's been in my family for 3 generations. It was my grandmother's recipe, and my grandmother was known as a great cook in her Greek community down in Los Angeles. And I didn't appreciate how wonderful a cook she was when I was growing up, until one time we visited some other Greek friends, and I got to taste their grandmother's cooking and realized that my grandma really knew what she was doing. She was a great cook, and she passed on that gift and that knowledge to my mother, who was a great cook, is a great cook. My mom makes the best dolmas in the entire world. Combine the sugar and the spices with the nuts. Once you have the sugar and the spices and the nuts combined, just set them aside and go on to the next step, which will be melting the butter and getting that ready for assembling the baklava. Our next step is to melt the butter. We need plenty of butter to brush between the leaves of the filo pastry. And remember, this butter, number 1, has to be butter, and number 2, it needs to be unsalted butter. You can melt the butter either on the stovetop or in a microwave. It really doesn't make any difference whatsoever. You will need a pastry brush in order to accomplish the task of brushing the butter in between the leaves. You will need 1 full pound of butter, 4 cubes. Baklava is not a lightweight dessert, and there's no way to make a light version of baklava. Just bite the bullet and do it the right way. It'll taste great, and really, you can't eat more than 1 piece at a time. It is so rich. Again, it's butter, and it needs to be unsalted, and then you melt it. Whether you melt the butter in the microwave or over the stove top, just be sure that you don't overdo it. You don't want browned butter. You just want melted butter. Now you can see that the butter is nicely melted, and the next step is to get everything ready for the final assembly of the baklava. Some important things to remember about phyllo dough. Number 1, if you buy it in the grocer's freezer section frozen, it does need to thaw. You can thaw it at room temperature for 5 hours, or you can leave it overnight. It's the last thing that you get ready, because once the phyllo is out, you've got to get moving. It's very thin. It can dry out very quickly. The frozen phyllo dough comes wrapped in a plastic wrap like this, and you need to remove it. Like so. And you need to unfold it. It'll have a piece of wax paper here, and you can start to unfold it. The phyllo is folded over. So the next step is to take it like this and unfold the dough completely. And you can see how thin it is. Paper thin. And because it's so thin, it can dry out quite quickly. That's why you want to have everything ready to go. You do not want to wait till the last minute. Okay, so we're ready. Got the melted butter, I've got the pan, I've got the filo. The bottom of the pan has to be generously brushed with butter, bottom and sides. A helpful hint before you begin the actual assembly is to cut the filo dough to size so that the sheets fit perfectly within your pan. There's nothing hanging and hardly any trimming that has to be done afterwards. So just line your pan up like so, hold on to it, and cut the dough. Now just take this excess dough and just strip it off. If you feel like you want to use it for some little hors d'oeuvre or something like that, that's fine. You can always save it. Put it back in a plastic bag. There. Okay, now we're really set. The sheets of filo will fit in very nicely in the pan. Now remember, you've buttered it all over, bottom and sides, and very generously. Next, come to your filo and pick up a sheet. It is paper thin, so try to be a little delicate. If you tear it, don't worry about it. Lay it in to the bottom of your pan, and see, thanks to the cutting, it fits in perfectly. Notice there's a little tear here. Does that matter? Not at all. It's not going to matter, number one, because there's going to be so many other sheets, and hopefully the top sheets will look fairly nice. But even if they don't, it really doesn't matter. You put enough honey syrup on something, and it's going to be okay. Just as the Bible says, love covers a multitude of sins, believe me, Greek honey syrup covers a multitude of little boo-boos. Okay, we're ready for the second sheet. Same thing, just lift it up carefully and drop it down. Now, please remember to brush generously with butter between each layer of filo, especially around the edges. And work as quickly as you can because you don't want the filo to dry out. For this size pan and for this particular recipe, you will need to use 1 1/2 pounds of filo dough. And you need to kind of eyeball it and divide it into thirds. A few more sheets on the bottom before I get started on the filling. We've used about 1/3 of our filo on the bottom. Remember, always alternating with the butter. Now, we're ready to use the filling. We pour in a little bit at a time, alternating with 2 or 3 layers of filo dough. So I'll put in about 1/3 of the nuts. Spread it out. Make it an even layer. You don't want to have a mound of nuts in the center of the baklava and no nuts at the end. And if you can't do a good job with the spatula, get in there and use your hands. Okay, there's a nice even layer of the nut mixture. And now 2 or 3 filo dough. What this does is this kind of holds the nuts in. Brush the dough with butter, of course, and just dab lightly with the pastry brush. Then another layer, and some more butter, and another layer. All right, another 1/3 or so portion of nuts. Again, spread it out as evenly as you can using your fingers, your hands. And 2 or 3 more phyllo dough. This is the last layer of nuts. Now you can see this is a little thicker than the other layers. I didn't measure exactly, and you know it just really doesn't make any difference. The important thing is that you don't have one big gigantic layer of nuts. They need to be alternated with the phyllo dough. Okay, so here we are, the nuts. Now we're ready for the final layers of phyllo dough. Notice that even though I did cut it, sometimes it's perfect this on one end and not perfect here. What you do is simply bump it up to one end like that. It meets perfectly here. Then with the next piece, make sure that it meets perfectly at the other end. Phyllo is actually very forgiving, and it's actually much easier to work with than you might imagine. Okay, so we just keep doing this. Phyllo layer, butter, phyllo layer, butter, phyllo layer, butter. Okay, down to the last piece of phyllo. On it goes. And this time, don't cut any corners with the butter. Slather that butter, especially on the edges and the corners. Get everything drenched in butter. This is important for one reason, and that's to aid you when you cut. If you have to cut the phyllo and it's dry, you're going to have a real hard time. But because of the moisture from the butter, it'll be an easier go for you. All right, there we go. We have 1 pan of baklava ready for trimming and cutting. The pan of baklava needs to be trimmed, and by that I mean getting rid of the excess phyllo that's in the corners and sometimes even on the edges. So you just take a nice sharp knife and cut right here and get rid of the excess. Now we come to the cutting. Baklava is cut before it is baked. You have these beautiful layers, all this butter, and now they need to be cut to shape. The traditional Greek shape is the diamond shape. That would require you to take a yardstick and make cuts diagonally in one direction and make cuts diagonally in the opposite direction so that you would come out with perfect little diamond shapes. Now another alternative to get this nice triangle shape is to make 3-inch by 3-inch squares and then cut those shapes in half diagonally, and you would get a nice triangle. For this pan, which is a 16 by 11 pan, I'm going to make 2-inch cuts and then 2 1/4-inch cuts. And it'll come out just about right. Nice sized rectangular pieces that are good for eating for dessert. I'm just marking where I'm going to make my cuts. The thing about baklava, you will cut all the way through. So I have my mark, and here I go. Use a sharp knife. And this is another place where having that extra butter helps, because you don't shatter the phyllo dough. Cut all the way through, the layers of phyllo on top, the layers of nuts, and the layers of phyllo at the bottom. Now we're ready to bake. Take your prepared baklava pan and place it in a 350-degree preheated oven. Let it bake 45 minutes to an hour. After 45 minutes, check it to make sure that it's a nice golden, toasty brown, and then it'll be ready for the syrup. While the baklava is baking, now you can begin assembling the syrup. And I'm going to tell you, the syrup is what makes the difference. My family's recipe is lots and lots and lots of honey. In fact, the proportions are 3 parts honey to 1 part water. To help you measure out your honey, make it a little easier, just use some of your leftover melted butter to brush the inside of your measuring cup. That way the honey won't stick so much and won't be so hard to get out. Okay, 3 cups of honey into your saucepan. And notice how it does come out a lot easier because of the butter that you put in. And we're going to add 1 cup of water. All that honey, water, and put this on the stove, medium-low heat. There's no need for this to cook, come to boil. The only thing that needs to happen is that it's heated and perfectly mixed. The honey mixed with the water to form a very rich honey syrup. All right, you can see our syrup has heated now. The only thing you need to do now is just turn off the heat and let it sit. It needs to get to about lukewarm temperature in order to be poured over the baklava. Okay, it's been 45 minutes, and let's check to see if the baklava is done. Oh yes, this is just perfect. See how it is nice and toasty and golden brown. You don't want it to get too dark because then it will have a burnt flavor. But if it's too light, it won't taste cooked at all. Take the baklava out of the oven and place it on a counter to cool. It needs to cool for at least a half hour before you pour the syrup over it. The baklava has cooled a half hour. Now it's time to pour the syrup on. Syrup should be just about at room temperature. Try to pour it on evenly. Now the thing about baklava is that it is a 2-day operation. You do all the baking, assembling, preparation, etc. one day, pour the syrup over it, and then it needs to sit overnight. Now, like now, it looks awfully juicy, and it is. But come tomorrow morning, most of that syrup will be absorbed. Keep the baklava in a safe place overnight. Well, good morning. The baklava has soaked overnight, and all that syrup has now been absorbed, as you can see. So we're at the exciting part, the part where we can start eating or distributing the baklava. If you're using it for party, just take it from your baking pan and put it into a nice Christmas platter. If you plan on giving it away to friends, take the pieces out and put them in a nice dish. The one thing you do want to do before you start taking the pieces out is to just go over everything with the knife one more time to make sure that when you initially cut, you got all the way through. And this is real easy now because the pieces have separated, so it doesn't take much time at all. Now that you've cut and you've made sure that everything is pretty loose and free, you can begin putting the baklava in plates. I recommend that you use a regular plate, plastic plate. Under no circumstances should you use paper plates, and please avoid the temptation to put the baklava in those cute, decorated, Christmassy cupcake liners. The problem is that the honey syrup acts like glue, and the baklava will actually end up glued to the paper plate or glued to the paper cupcake liner, and it makes for a harder eating experience, and it's not as pleasant. So you just start working out a couple pieces and put it on your plate. And you can see there's still plenty of syrup oozing at the bottom, and that's good. When it comes to storing baklava, just cover it lightly with some plastic wrap. Don't store it for longer than 10 days to 2 weeks. Under no circumstances should you put it in the refrigerator. Baklava refrigerated tastes terrible, and if you want to bring it to room temperature, it'll have to sit out for anywhere from 2 to 4 hours to bring it to room temperature. There is no effective way to heat baklava and quickly bring it to room temperature. Microwaving it just destroys all the hard work that you've done. So you can plate it up in pretty plates, cover it with saran wrap, and give it out to friends, or put it in a nice platter and save it for a party. Now here's something. These little corners here, you can see they're not perfectly square. They're kind of funny looking. And these corners, it's just not respectable. You can't give them to friends. You can't give them to relatives. You can't give them to co-workers that you're trying to impress. So the only thing you can possibly do with these pieces is give them to your family or to the camera crew. So this Christmas, give your friends and neighbors a precious gift from Greece. Homemade, delicious baklava. Kala Christuinya.